Alright, kiddies, welcome to part 2 of Horror Nights history. Curse of the Cryptkeeper. Okay. Alright, when I left off in the previous portion, a chapter, whatever you want to call it, segment, I had just gotten into talking about the success of William M. Gaines and his EC Comics, which, by the time the great horror trifecta and the horror comics, they became huge success, and they were outselling Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman. They were outselling the superhero comics of the era, and they were becoming this enormous success. And that's what the kids love to read, along with the true crime and war comics that he also put out to get away from what had been cliched. Now, he changed the name of EC Comics. It had been Educational Comics when his dad Max was doing it, but now they were Entertaining Comics. But at the same time, there was a little bit of education and morality going through, the ethical stuff behind the stories, as I said. He also came up with another little comic book which was a parody of other comic books. You know, Superman became Super Duper Man, and Batman and Robin became Batboy and Reuben. And it was, very funny, and interestingly enough, he gave it the title, something like Tales Calculated to Drive You Mad. That's right, Mad, which would ultimately become a magazine and a television show on Fox. But at the time, it started out as a regular comic book. Well, everything went fine and dandy until this German guy showed up. I kind of started talking about that at the end of the previous video, but let's talk about him now. His name was Friedrich Wertham, and he came over to the United States after the war. Of course, during the war, he was a good German. He wasn't, Western political or anything. Oh, really? Like a lot of rocket scientists and other intellectual people who might help the United States against communism, certain people's pasts were overlooked when they were paperclip brought over to the United States and allowed to settle in. Things were, just erase some facts there, and sure, now you're in. Anyway, so this guy came in, Friedrich Wertham, and no, he didn't have any trouble with, Jewish people or anything, but strangely enough, he wrote this book where he suggested very strongly, he downright declared it, that America was being threatened by evil Jewish communists. Yes. Let's make it even more specific. Evil communist Jewish homosexuals. Yes. Who was it who hated communist Jews and homosexuals and put them in concentration camps? Oh yeah, I remember. Anyway, so he said his idea was that this was a conspiracy to destroy America's young people with comic books. That comic books were all written by communist homosexual Jews, and that if the children read them, it would turn them into juvenile delinquents, and it would make them all turn gay. Because if you read Superman, you would become a bully boy and a delinquent, and you probably go off and wear your hair in a ducktail, because this was the 50s, and people were really worried about the juvenile delinquents. If they read Batman and Robin, they'd go queer right away, because Bruce and Dick lived together in a mansion with a butler, and they wear ascots and bathrobes or whatever, and have nice flowers. So obviously they're... Anyway, all of these stories that he came up with, and it was in a book called The Seduction of the Innocent. And he declared very strongly that this was a deliberate attempt, and that they put secret messages, and if you turn the pages the right way, you would see, something frightening like a vagina, and you would find out that your children are being subliminally altered in their brains, and they're being turned into, their moral center was being destroyed so that they become weak, shiftless, and the Russians would be able to invade us and destroy us completely because we had no discipline. We must have the youth to be trained for discipline, to be strong. We should have strong young folk in this country. Never mind. I didn't say young folk. That means something else in another country. But anyway, that was basically what he was saying, that Nazi bastard. Right about the same time, of course, a fellow named Joe McCarthy was showing up in Congress and saying, I have a list of known communists. And never bothered to tell us who was on the list, but people in the entertainment industry, all sorts of people were getting blacklisted. They're taken to Congress to testify, and if you said, when you try to declare the Fifth Amendment, you're declared in contempt of Congress and thrown in jail. The Constitution was being pissed on, all right and left. It was a time that we came very close into following the footsteps of fascism in our own country. We came very, very close to this. Until, fortunately, a man named Murrow told McCarthy that he had no shame, and, well, you can go look it up. But the damage had already been done for the comic book industry. Along with all these other things, Congress, having read Friedrich Wertham's book, became very worried about those comic books and were there some sort of communists involved. And so they had comic book people brought in to Congress to testify, whether or not they were communists planting seditious material in these comic books to corrupt the youth of America. And William Gaines thought this was ridiculous, and he went in there, with kind of like Rodney Dangerfield, thinking, and he was fat, by the way, going in there to, what? Hey, this is ridiculous, and trying to make some jokes, and he got crucified. He came out of there shaking like a leaf. They'd accused him, of every horrible thing you can imagine, being every kind of pervert and sex offender and deviant and cannibal, necrophiliac, communist, Satanist, God knows what they were. He came out of there shaking like a leaf, and he knew when he came out of there that it was over. Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, Haunt of Fear, all the horror comics abolished from that point on. Never again. The only thing he published that he could continue publishing after that was Mad. And he took his revenge in Mad because he started making it full of political satire. And by the 1960s, it became one of the favorites of the counterculture and the hippie love generation. And Gaines' hair, incidentally, by that time became this big, huge thing, and a beard. And he became like a big, latter-day hippie himself. With his kind of glasses like mine, but he had this big beard and hair, and he just had a heck of a good time and a sense of humor. And in the early 70s, he went over to Moscow as a tourist back when you first started letting people go tourists there. And whenever he walked around Red Square or anywhere in Moscow, everyone would stare at him. And he said, "What's the deal?" And he asked his tour guide, "Why do they do that? Have they never seen an American before?" "Oh, no, sir. That is not... it is just with your hair and beard, you look just like Karl Marx. And everyone wants to look because you look like the father of communism here." That was just a cute story there, the last bit. But yeah, so that was the story of the Cryptkeeper originally. But he wasn't dead, even though he only lasted for a few years in the 50s in the comics, because the kids who read those comics in the 50s, did it warp their brain and turn them into social deviants? No, but it made them want to make horror movies or write horror novels when they grew up, and some of them did, because some of them became Stephen King, and some of them became Steven Spielberg, and some of them became, Richard Donner or Robert Zemeckis. And so some of these kids grew up wanting to do this kind of stuff. And early on in the early 70s, in all places, the United Kingdom, somebody got a hold of these comics and said, these were bloody brilliant. Oh, we should make a movie out of these. And so they did. They made 2 movies, Tales from the Crypt and The Vault of Horror. And now the Crypt Keeper is played by Sir Ralph Richardson in a nice brown robe. Turned out it was actually the devil all along in the movie. Now, curiosity. But it wasn't until the 80s when some of these very people I was talking about before, like Zemeckis and Donner and the others, got together and made the TV series Tales from the Crypt for HBO. Because on HBO, by that point, you could start having real violence. So if you get like the British movie and then you get the first episodes of the TV series, they have that Psychopath on Christmas, which is kind of like Home for the Holidays house, if you remember the Home for the Holidays house from 2006. That same story is done twice with 2 different actresses. One of them is Joan Collins. So you can compare those 2 versions if you're into that sort of thing. And I've really gone off on wild tangents on these videos, and maybe 4 of them, because I went so much in the backstory of the Crypt Keeper. But the Crypt Keeper was turned into this, instead of just being a dude in a robe, they said, we're going to do something, let's make him into like a living corpse. But we can't do a guy in a costume or makeup because, if a guy puts on makeup, usually it's more, So if a guy's normal sized, he puts on extra makeup, he looks fatter. And you have to get like an anorexic guy, or maybe someone who's missing a limb, and then put makeup on him, and he might look like a corpse. But the best way to do it is like animatronics, and now we've got animatronics and puppetry, so they combined like animatronics with like Henson-style puppets, and they created this wonderful character that just seemed alive, like Kermit the Frog or somebody. You didn't think of the actor or someone performing in it and doing the voice. You thought of the Crypt Keeper as a person, as an actual celebrity of himself. And he hosted the show for 7 seasons. Interesting enough, the last season was all shot in the UK with British actors, so it sort of came full circle from the British movies. And the show was just in its last moments in 1995. It had its peak just before that. So at that time, Universal thought, well, that's a popular character. He's got a hit HBO show. Let's rent the character, pay off HBO, which I think at that time had already become a part of Warner Brothers. And they had bought EC Comics, later on, and that's why Warner's also bought DC Comics, but they also bought the company that published Mad Magazine at some point, and that's why that magazine, if it's still published, I think it is still published, is published by the same company that publishes DC Comics today. And so, in a strange way, it's all come back together because one of the first places Siegel and Schuster went with Superman was to Max Gaines, and he turned them down, the putz. Anyway, because then he would have been rich his whole life. So they took the idea of the Crypt Keeper and paid off Warner Brothers to have the character, and the curse of the Crypt Keeper. He became the first icon of Halloween Horror Nights. A character that would preside over the event, be in all the advertising, and would be present as the host of the event. And so that year, we had 4 haunted houses. They only listed 3, but one of those was a dual house. Now, I mentioned that there were 2 different mazes in the Boneyard, but this time it was really 2 separate houses under one aegis, with 2 separate queue areas and everything. And this is a tradition that continued for several years. I think through '98 at Universal Studios was a house called Universal's House of Horror. It had different names, the Museum of Horror and whatever of Horror, but it started in '95 as Universal's House of Horror. And in the very first time they did it, they started the tradition of one side being old and one side being new. I'm rapidly running out of time again, so this is going to have to go to part 3 soon. But on the old side, you had the classic Universal monsters of Dracula, Frankenstein, Wolfman. On the new side, you had newer concepts and monsters and creatures, or serial killers and frightening things from more recent movies, Freddy, Jason, Chucky type of things. Now, they did that house several times under different names from 95 to 98 at least. We're talking at least 3 years. That's 95, 96, 97, no, 4 years at least. I can go back and double check to see if they did it every single year, but I'm running out of time again.